Hi, Cindy here from Pure Simple Photoshop. Today is part 2 of how to correct Moiré in images. As I explained in part 1, Moiré is a interference pattern. Sometimes it looks like this, where you have rainbow colors, and sometimes it's just the pattern itself and no colors. And in part 1 of the video, I showed how Photoshop has automated tools to correct this, but sometimes the automated tools don't do it well enough. If you have a very bad version of it, you may need to do something manually to fix it. I'm going to show how I fix this, especially when you're dealing with solid colors like this. We'll go from there. All right, so in order to fix this, I like to use frequency separation. So I'm going to run through how to set up frequency separation and show you how to fix the Moiré effect from that. So first off, what we're going to do is just duplicate our background so that we have 2 copies. Command J twice will do that for us. And I'm going to turn off the visibility on the top copy. And on this bottom copy, I'm going to add a blur layer, and that's the first step with frequency separation. You need to blur out the texture that you want to be editing. So when we put the blur in, we're going to use Gaussian blur, filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And what we want is this to be blurred enough that you can no longer see that texture. Now, for this particular image, it's going to be actually quite high, much higher than we normally use when we're doing frequency separation. So you can still see the texture there, so we're going to bring it up a little bit more, a little bit more. And right about there is where I can no longer see that texture, which is quite high for frequency separation, but it's still going to work. We're going to say OK, and then I'm just going to rename this layer so I know what it is and call it blur. Now, the second layer for frequency separation is going to be the texture layer. And I'm going to just call this texture. And how we do this is we go up to Image, Apply Image, and you want the layer to be not merged. You want the blur layer to be the layer that you're applying to your to this layer. The blending, we want the blending to be subtract. Now this layer is, or this picture is an 8-bit image. You can see it says 8-bit right there in the title of it. There are actually different settings depending on whether this is an 8-bit or a 16-bit image. So on an 8-bit image, what we want is subtract, scale 2, offset 128. Now if this was a 16-bit image, then the settings are invert, add, scale is still 2, but the offset is 0. Now you'll notice that this looks very similar, that they both look very similar. Actually, I'm going to apply this and I'll just show you what happens. The next step with this is to add linear light. And then if I put these into a group, if I turn this off and on, I don't know if you can see this. It's evident on my monitor. I'm not sure if the recording of it will show it, but when I click this off and on, there is a slight difference happening with the image. That is an indication that I have done it wrong. If you do it correctly, it should not make any difference whatsoever. So we're just going to fix this. I'm going to grab another black background copy. I'm going to call this texture again. And that, by the way, is why when you're setting up frequency separation, you should always throw it into a group and turn it off and on so that you can see if you've goofed it up. So we're going to do this again. We're going to use the right settings this time. No invert, subtract, scale 2, offset 128, and say OK. And make sure it's on linear light and turn them on. And so if I turn this on and off, now there's no shifting whatsoever when I'm looking at this image. So we've done it correctly. All right, so my next step is I always like to make a duplicate copy, especially when I'm going to be affecting the texture copy. I make a duplicate copy of it, so if I goof it up, I don't have to restart all over again. The texture layer, once you affect it, you can't really undo those very easily. I make a duplicate copy just in case I really goof up. So we're going to work on the texture layer, and that's how we're going to get rid of this effect. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use our clone stamp You could use the healing brush as well for this. Either one will work pretty much the same. And all I'm going to do is make sure I'm on current layer only. Current and below or all layers won't work. Actually, if you have it set to current and below, what you will get is something that looks like this. Some sort of weirdness will show up and you will know that you have done that wrong. So you want this to be current layer only. Select where the texture is good, and then we're just going to paint it in where the texture isn't good. And you can see that this is just a matter of selecting your point and going across and getting rid of that texture. And we're going to do the same thing down here. Now, because we're only doing the texture, I don't actually have to worry about the gradients that are happening with this image. Why I didn't do this as just regular clone stamping, like why I've done the frequency separation, is because I can stamp the texture in, but the color isn't being affected. Like even though I'm using this dark point here, when I clone it up here, it doesn't change the color. That's why we don't do this using regular clone stamping or healing brush. We do it on a frequency separation layer, because that way we don't have to worry about the gradients that are happening on the image. And so since we have this set up, we might as well just fix this line where her bra is while we're in here, and we'll fix the moire that's happening here, and you can just go over wherever in the image you have a bit of texture issues. You can fix this. You can also use this technique to get rid of these little wrinkles. You know, if you wanted to make the dress perfectly smooth, you could do that in here as well. All right, so that is how we get rid of moire using frequency separation, and it's fairly good. Now, the one thing that I will mention is sometimes moire has a rainbow color effect with it. When it has a rainbow color effect, it's you have to do one extra step before doing the frequency separation. So I'm going to just show you what that is. I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm just going to grab my paintbrush, literally just B for brush, and holding down the Option key to select a paint color, I'm going to select this darker gray color that's right in here, and I'm just going to paint over this part. And yes, it looks ugly. It looks like, you know, not good. And I'm just choosing a couple of different colors because there is a couple of different colors in here. But the effect will actually work if you just use one color as well. It's all good. And we're just going to paint over all the spots where we have the rainbow color. Just like that. Now you could also do this by making a selection and filling the selection with color, all the same color. Either way works just as well. I personally like to just paint in because I find it just as easy to paint it where I need it to be. Now I know that looks horrible, right? So the magic part is blend modes. We're going to go up here to the blend mode, and we're going to change that blend mode to color. And then what happens is the texture comes back, but now the color is gone, right? So instead of this ugly rainbow color, we now have a black ribbon again. Now, depending on what you're doing, that may be all you have to do to fix the moire pattern. But if you want to change it so that you don't have these areas where the pattern is wrong, then what we then do is work on frequency separation. So the next step will be to make a stamp visible layer. The command for that is Command Option Shift and E. So this is a layer that has, if I turn off everything else, you can see this is a layer that has that correction already in it. And then we're going to make a duplicate layer of that. This one is going to be our blur layer, and this one is going to be our texture layer. And then we're just going to set up frequency separation. So we're going to go in here and go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur. I actually have a shortcut for that, but for you guys, I'm going in there to show you where it is on the menu. And again, we want to blur this so that we don't have texture on the ribbon any longer, but not any more than you need. So we always want to try to get as minimal blur as possible without having the texture. So that actually does it for us here. Again, we're going to go up to the texture layer, image, apply image. This is again 8 bits, so not inverted, subtract, scale to offset 128. That's what my post-it note says. And make sure you change this layer to be the blur layer. It will almost always default to merged, and you definitely want the blur layer there. And when you have it correct, you'll see a grade scale image of your effect. And then go here to the blend mode and change this to linear light. We're going to put these into a group. Command G to make a group. And when I'm going to put the other 2 layers back on, and when I turn this off and on again, there's no shift in the color. Again, going to make a duplicate copy of the texture. And then we can go in here and use our clone stamp tool and correct this texture. Now, because this ribbon is actually symmetrical, I'm going to use the texture from this side to paint over on this side. And we can just go in and correct the texture that should be on this ribbon. So just like that. And on this side, I can use this texture over here and do the same thing. Now, I probably wouldn't do this step. In this particular image, you're only seeing a really cropped in version of this image. And you probably wouldn't have seen the texture on this particular image because it's very small. However, if this was a close-up, you will probably need to do this type of correction. And so there we go. And so now we have the texture back in how it's supposed to be. So again, the before and the after, making that correction and making the ribbon have the ribbon texture all the way through it. All right, so that's how you do it, especially if you have rainbow colors. To make the correction, use a color blend mode layer, paint in the color it should be, and switch your blend mode to color, and it will get rid of all of the crazy rainbow colors. Okay, so that is how to fix Moiré. I hope that this helps you, and if you have any questions, as always, send me a text. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.